situate our discussion. I have to start by mentioning the unfortunate news that one of our panelists wasn't able to make it. He was unfortunately involved in an incident that made it impossible for him to travel. And we learned about this very recently. Frank Calzon, he sent us, however, a few points that I will read before the actual discussion starts. And but we're very fortunate to have both Javier Corrales and Rosa María here, who combine, academic expertise with real-life experience with activism to talk about a topic that is incredibly important nowadays, not only because of what the protests represent within Cuba, but also because of the importance that Cuba itself has within Latin America and in the relationship between Latin America and the United States. So I'm bringing out information coming from a Human Rights Watch report that was elaborated after the protests happened last summer. And I'm going to just cite some things that were included there to situate this. So on July 11, 2021, thousands of Cubans took to the streets in the largest nationwide demonstration against the government since the 1959 revolution. At the very least, according to Human Rights, this is the largest mobilization since the revolution happened, which would be really extraordinary. Some other commentators have pointed to 1994 as the most recent episode of mobilization of that scale. Either 94 or 59, we're talking about something of incredible significance. These peaceful protests were a response to long-standing restrictions on rights, food, and medicine scarcity, and the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Many protesters chanted liberty, or motherland and life, which is what you were listening to in the short clip that was projected a moment ago, which is a rallying cry that kind of turns on its head a historical phrase of the revolution, which was Patria o muerte, homeland or death, signifying the sacrifices that the revolutionaries were supposed to undergo in order to have sovereignty. And these protesters are trying to send the message that you don't have to choose between homeland or life, and that people should have the right to both the homeland and their own life, referencing a Cuban song that repurposes the government's old slogan and criticizes repression in the country. President Miguel Díaz-Canel at the time urged government supporters and security forces to respond to the protests with force. We call, and I'm citing President Díaz-Canel, we call on all revolutionaries to go to the streets to defend the revolution, he said. The order to fight has been given. A crackdown ensued where a wide range of human rights violations were perpetrated against well-known government critics and ordinary citizens, including harassment, arbitrary detention, abuse-ridden prosecutions, beatings, and other cases of ill treatment that in some cases constituted torture. For anyone who's interested in knowing more about the protests themselves and the crackdown that ensued, I very much recommend looking at the Human Rights Watch report that was written based on 170 interviews that were made in the island with people who lived through the protests themselves. So we're here to talk about the origins and consequences of these protests. And we have, as I said before, an extraordinary panel for this. Before introducing the panelists themselves, I want to make mention of the role played by Seth Rock, a student who is present right here in the first row of this auditorium, to make this event possible. Really, I have been a facilitator more than anything else of this event. He was the architect of this, and he was so excited to do this that I very much encouraged him to do so and help him to garner the resources that he needed to do so. He was my student in a course of Latin America a few semesters ago, and I'm very proud of him doing this type of thing. Okay, so as I said before, we have two extraordinary panelists here, and Frank, who won't be able to be here, but I'm gonna say a few words about him too. So Rosa María Payá Acevedo is a Cuban democracy activist and human rights defender. In 2015, she founded the citizen initiative Cuba Desde, a movement in favor of changing the political and economic systems in Cuba towards democracy through a plebiscite. She is the daughter of the late Osvaldo Payá, the recipient of the European Parliament's Sakharov Prize and two-time nominee of the Nobel Peace Prize, who was killed by the regime in 2012. Rosa María is a graduate of physics at the University of Havana and of the Global Competitive Leadership Program at Georgetown University. She has been a lecturer and guest of honor at various universities throughout the United States and Latin America, as well as the United Nations, the Conferencia Summit of the Americas, the Freedom Forum, the U.S. Congress, and multiple parliaments in Europe and the Americas. Javier Corrales. Javier Corrales is Dwight Morrow 1895 Professor of Political Science at a sister institution, Amherst College, in Massachusetts. He obtained his PhD in Political Science from Harvard University in 1996. Corrales' research focuses on democratization, presidential powers, ruling parties, democratic backsliding, populism, political economy of development, oil and energy, the incumbent's advantage, foreign policies, and sexuality. I have to say, Professor Corrales is one of the most prolific academics that I have ever known. It's really amazing the breadth and scope of his research interest and how much he has written about all these issues. Let me just add that as the son of Cuban exiles, his life and career have been influenced by what he himself describes as democratic failures. So one fantastic, I think, feature of our panel today is that the two people who are here and the person who wasn't able to make it all have been directly impacted by the trajectory of Cuban politics during both the 20th and the 21st century. Finally, Frank Calzón was born in 1944 in Cuba, moved to the US shortly after the 1959 revolution. He graduated from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. While in college, he was an active member of several student organizations that denounced human rights abuses in Cuba. I mention this because he was instrumental at the time, at a very young age, in the pressure to liberate and free several political prisoners, including the poets Alberto Padilla and Armando Valladares. After graduating from Georgetown, Frank worked for several years at the Organization of American States, and later became the vice president of Freedom House, an organization that promotes and measures democracy throughout the world, and eventually founded the Center for a Free Cuba, think tank that has been devoted to promoting political change in Cuba. Okay, I want to add one very brief thing, which is that, you know, I would like us to take advantage of the extraordinary knowledge that is accumulated here in this panel, and so we will give our panelists ample opportunity to present their views about the protests, but we also want to make this a dialogue, okay? And so we will also have plenty of opportunity for you to ask questions to them about, you know, the trajectory of the regime, the protests themselves, you know, their implications, etc., etc. And recently, both of our panelists have expressed to me their desire to engage in this conversation with all of you. So the way that we will work is the panelists will have approximately 15 to 20 minutes to express their views regarding the origins and consequences of the protests, and then we'll have a rejoinder between the panelists, and then we will open for Q&A. Now, because Frank isn't here and he won't have the opportunity to present his own views, I will write an email that he sent a few hours ago to express, or rather listing some ideas that he wanted to bring to the panel. This comes with the obvious caveat that these are, you know, Frank's views, and obviously not mine. Okay, so Frank wrote 10 facts on today's Cuba. The following is a summary of what I wanted to present. I am in the hospital and regret I will not be with you. I would like to thank Professor Ibarra and Colgate, students at Prof, who made this panel discussion possible. It is always a good thing to start quoting the author of The Roots of Totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt, who wrote that an opinion to be credible needs to be based on the facts. These are some of the facts that inform my opinion on the subject under discussion. But first, context is essential. Fidel Castro led a revolution in the late 1950s, promising a return to democracy, multi-party elections, and the rule of law. Second point, Fidel lied. He repeatedly assured the Cuban people and foreign audiences that he was not a communist. As John Kennedy said, Castro betrayed his own revolution. By 1962, this is the third point that Frank sent, Cuba was a carbon copy of the Soviet Union without freedom of religion, freedom of the press, or an independent labor movement. The country was a single totalitarian state under the Communist Party. The regime had taken over every major economic activity, banks, sugar mills, manufacturers, as well as cultural, political, social activity on the island. Before the end of 1962, point number 4, Castro brought the world to the brink of nuclear disaster with the introduction of nuclear weapons and his request to Khrushchev to carry out a preemptive nuclear attack on the United States. 5, by 1968, with the revolutionary offensive, Castro had confiscated what was left of the economy, barbershops, food stands, newspaper stands. Today, Cuban farmers go to prison for selling their chicken, milk to anyone but the government. 6, in the early 80s and the beginning of the internet, the collapse of the socialist Central European countries and the death of Fidel Castro. Also, I think this point is missing something. I think the point he's trying to make here is that although Fidel Castro died, his brother Raúl took his place. Okay, the point, sorry, it's a phrase that it's broken. So I'm trying to make sense of it. I think this was probably a typo as he was writing in the hospital. I believe the point that he's trying to make is that during at this moment in the 80s, things began to change. And then later, Fidel Castro passed the baton to Raúl. There have been many political prisoners during the tenure of the communist regime. In the last couple of years, in an unprecedented way, the Catholic Church began to speak out to Cubans not to raise their hands against other Cubans, that is, not to denounce other Cubans to the regime. 8, the Central Committee of the Communist Party is old white generals, veterans of the guerrilla wars of the 1950s. But the opposition is the true reflection of the population made up of women, men, straight, gay, black, white, artists, athletes, believers. 9, after 62 years, the dream of Fidel of creating a new socialist man has not happened. And the Cubans, like the Poles, Lithuanians, Czechs, Slovaks, etc., reject communism and protest peacefully on the streets. There are more than 1,000 of them that went to prison since the demonstration a year ago, in addition to thousands of others already in Castro's gulags. Okay, I'm gonna stop right here, and I'm gonna let first Professor Corrales start with his presentation, okay? So I'm gonna project on the screen the PowerPoint. I'm gonna leave this with you so that you can. Yeah. You want to stand?
Well, I want to be able to see the slides.
Perfect.
So I would prefer to be here. My apologies, but I also want to make sure I can see what I'm showing you. So I need to be near a microphone. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. So,
how about if I do that? Yeah, that was great. Testing.
Yeah, that works.
Okay. Let me just check this, make sure it works. Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you very much, Professor Ibarra. Seth, thank you very much. I'm honored to be sharing the panel. I'm sorry Frank wasn't here, but Rosa, María, Payá, what an honor it is for me to be here. And thank you to all of you for being here. I love it. I think this is great. I teach at Amherst College, which is a liberal arts college, much like Colgate University, and it's a beautiful campus. You guys are so lucky to be here. I hope you enjoy it. But I also like it because who knows why you're here, but at least it tells me that you care a little bit about the questions that we're going to be talking about, which are really about Cuba, naturally, but more deeply about the status of democracy in the world and authoritarianism and how we can survive or prevent a deepening of autocracies in the world. It's a big deal. I know many of my students, for example, are constantly telling me about their biggest causes, and a lot of them have to do with social justice, and it always moves me. But in many ways, I always think maybe as a political scientist, it's very difficult to advance social justice in contexts where democracy is lacking. And so for me, it has a sense of hierarchy to talk about democracy or the lack of democracy. And Cuba is a country that has, in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of most respected analysts, lacked democracy for much of its independence, regrettably, but it has been especially terrible under the Cuban Revolution. So what I'm going to talk about is, there's always this debate about Cuba, and I just want to get it out of the way before we listen to Rosa and Payá, and that is the debate about the role of the US embargo in Cuba. And what I'm going to talk about is that in Cuba at the moment, there really are two embargoes in place. The one that is imposed by the United States, which is the one that draws everyone's attention. But there's a second embargo, which is the one that's imposed by the Cuban government on the Cuban people. And I want to talk about the analytical power of each. And basically what I'm going to say is, of course, the US embargo plays a role, but it's minimal compared to the second embargo, the one that the Cuban government imposes on its citizens. So that's my argument. Before I get to it, let me just say, I begin with a preamble. Make no mistake about it, I have become against the embargo over the years. It's been a political evolution. It's not relevant, except for you to know that I'm not a believer in it. Nevertheless, I don't think that the embargo is really the culprit of Cuba's major economic and political calamities. So let's review the evidence on behalf of the embargo. The embargo was set in place in 1960 and deepened in 1962, and has been altered over the years, but the very basic idea is that the United States bans US corporations from doing trade with Cuba to some extent. Now, that said, remarkably, the embargo is incredibly porous. This is a graph that accounts for US imports of and US exports. US imports from Cuba and US exports to Cuba. And what I want you to notice is that starting in the year 2000, even though the embargo was tightened legally in so many ways, we have really traded quite a bit with Cuba. We're selling a significant amount of agricultural and medical products to Cuba. And it's a big change. It's remarkable that the law has been tightened to some extent, but the economic activity has increased so much, in fact, that here you have a comparison of Cuba's most important trading partners, and you can see the role of the United States. I don't think I have a pointer here, so okay. But if you notice, the United States currently is perhaps the 6th most important trading partner of Cuba. This is something that doesn't deny the fact that there are many economic activities that we cannot conduct with Cuba. But the most remarkable thing about Cuba is that despite the US efforts, there is very little that the United States can do to block trade between Cuba and almost every other country in the world, including strong allies of the United States, such as Canada, or members of the European Union, or strong enemies of the United States, like China and Russia. We have very little leverage. And in fact, I'm going to tell you one little secret. The embargo is actually an incentive for investments in Cuba, because it is one of the few places in the Western Hemisphere, at least, where private actors can invest and they don't have to compete with American corporations. So you can start your hotel and not have to worry about the Marriotts and the Hiltons of the world. So in many ways, the embargo produces greater incentives for economic activities. If we don't see enough economic activity in Cuba, especially foreign economic activity, it's really not because of the embargo. It's something else. Now, Cuba, another way in which the embargo has relaxed over the years is the rise in tourism. Now, prior to COVID and the pandemic, here is the trend. This is a chart from The Economist, and this is a number of tourists visiting Cuba. And what I want you to notice is that Cuba had a period of a lot of tourism in the late 40s and 1950s, right before the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban government turned again tourism heavily, but with the demise of the Soviet Union right around 1991, the Cuban government began to promote tourism big time to this day. It has turned into your average Caribbean nation trying to obtain the most amount of revenues from exports of tourism services. And it's a big deal. It's an absolute big deal. And an important part of that is, of course, also U.S. citizens. Not all of it, but it has been a major component. So the embargo exists in paper, but it's overstated in terms of its suffocating powers. Now that said, it is true that the embargo does hurt the economy. The most important issues is the United States, for example, doesn't extend credit to Cuba. So Cuba has to pay in cash. That's true, that's hard. And Cuba has trouble borrowing abroad. That is definitely an impediment. But Cuba has plenty of credit facilities from its most important benefactors, China, Russia, and many other Western nations. So again, the United States does not rule the world, and Cuba has diversified its trading portfolio, and it really could be able to, as many countries do, survive without trade with the United States. And every once in a while, some U.S. and some foreign investors decide not to invest in Cuba in fear that they're going to be receiving sanctions. But I don't think we have a lot of evidence for this, evidence of actual corporations that decide not to go for big investments in Cuba. So let's talk about the second embargo, the restrictions that the Cuban government imposes on its citizens. All right, when the Cuban Revolution came, it carried out one of the most dramatic transformations in the economy of any society, which is to turn a society where the private sector was dominant and most people worked for the private sector, and turned everyone into employees of the public sector. Everybody became a worker for the public sector, the state, the ruling party. This was part of the ideology of defeating capitalism, and the goal was met. The private sector in Cuba essentially disappeared, especially by the late 1960s. In the mid-1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed and Cuba had a major crisis, the government began to open up a little bit to the private sector. But the reforms were so modest, so baby steps, so restrictive in so many ways, that all that the regime has been able to do in terms of expanding the private sector is 9% of the population. This is tiny, and it's also intentional. The Cuban government continues to believe that the biggest threat to the nation is the rise of independent wealth. Wealth that can be accumulated by private actors. It knows that it's almost unimaginable for any economy to grow without a private sector engine. You need both the public and the private sector. But in Cuba, to this day, they continue to keep that engine incredibly repressed. You talk to any Cuban, and all that Cubans want to do is to be able to have some independent means of generating wealth. They can't. They cannot do it, not because of the embargo, but because of Cuba's domestic laws regarding property rights, investment rights, and association rights. So self-employed is all that you really have. The figure there for other private mostly involves foreign investors. So it's very, very tiny. It is very different from China, Vietnam, and other communist societies, any other societies governed by communist parties that have decided to facilitate the private sector. In Cuba, they don't do that. Here's one way to depict the same point that I have been making. There's an organization in Washington, D.C. called the Heritage Foundation. It's an organization that measures the degree to which countries are open to business. Many people criticize them for being very neoliberal. They are. Well, you know, this is the one you want to go when you want to see how business-oriented a country is, because they're not going to give you great inflation. They are hardcore in terms of doing this. So they rank countries from 0 to 100, 100 being the most market-oriented countries in the world. They don't think anybody gets that score, kind of like probably here nobody gets an A+. Maybe A pluses do exist at Code, right? So nobody gets A pluses. So that nobody gets the top scores. But we have countries at the very top, just so that you know, a country like Sweden. Has anybody visited Sweden? It's a social democracy, but Sweden here scores almost like a very high score, above 70. You see the world average. I hope you can see it. That would be the oh, I wish I had a picture, but it would be the highest, the flattest line. That's the world average. And then you have Vietnam below and Cuba. Cuba is in the category of some of the most repressed countries in the world in terms of economic activities. Even more repressed than when Vietnam was under serious communist rule. And since the mid-2000s, notice that Vietnam has been getting more and more open about business, making room for the private sector. But Cuba, if anything, it has become more restrictive, maybe. It's a very unusual case of survival of communist command economy rule. We don't have a lot of cases like this anymore. And the reason this survives, despite the fact that everybody tells the Cuban government that they need to change, is because the Cuban government continues to believe that the only way that it can survive is if society remains impoverished without independent means of generating wealth. So what are the things that the government do? Let's look at the labor code. These are some of the things. Workers work for the public sector and they cannot change jobs without government permission. Foreign companies, if they want to hire, cannot hire freely. They need to ask permission for the state. The state decides who gets to work for one of those corporations, and the state pays them in Cuban pesos rather than in foreign currencies. Let's take a look at rules for foreign investment. Here's where the big embargo is. There are very few wholly owned private enterprises in Cuba. Most foreigners cannot own land. There are no private lawyers in Cuba available to help you with any contracts that you might have. And now let's look at the restrictions of the private sector. The Cuban government has basically excluded anybody with a college degree from starting their own business. You can do a small business if it's a profession that doesn't require a high skill trade. There are no independent credit markets. There are restrictions in the number of employees you can have. I think the current number is about 20 employees maximum, so that allows you to open a restaurant, but certainly nothing more than a private enterprise. You have incredibly high taxes. Almost nobody in the private sector can engage in trade, regardless. So you cannot buy imports or sell commodities abroad. And there are no independent courts. So no independent courts in Cuba, again, means that it's almost impossible for private actors to have a trusted institution that they can go to whenever they have a dispute with a vendor or with any other party with which they have contracts. So the result is that you have here two embargoes. Both hurt Cuba, but what I have tried to convey to you is that the most serious one is the second embargo. It's an embargo that has seen almost no equal since the end of the Cold War. It was very common to see these kind of societies during the Cold War, but it hasn't changed one bit. And it hasn't changed one bit, not because the demand for it doesn't exist. Even close members of the ruling party talk about the need to open up a little bit the economy. But the ruling party, time and time again, blocks all these changes, keeps the embargo in place. And this is one of the reasons for Cuba's continued immiseration. Cuba is a country that in the 1950s, despite many of its economic problems, was one of the wealthiest countries in the Americas, far wealthier than some European countries like Italy and Spain, for example. And now it's one of the poorest in the world. And in many ways, this is homegrown and an important reason why Cubans are protesting like they've never had before. So to conclude, here's an analogy that I want you to take with you when you think about what did Javier Corrales say about the embargo. Well, here's a takeaway. To blame the embargo, the US embargo, on Cuba's problem is a little bit like saying that the problem with a cancer patient is that they're not eating enough vegetables, or that they don't have an American diet. We know that an American diet can be healthy. Some parts of it can be very unhealthy. This is capitalism. Either way, the diet is really not going to address the fundamental problem of Cuba's pathology. It's cancer. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Corrales. This has been incredibly illustrative. I'm sure students will have plenty of questions once we move to that, and I have a few of my own. But now we're going to listen to Rosa María Payá, who is going to, perhaps react to some of the things that Professor Corrales has presented, and present her views of her own in regards to. I think Professor Corrales' presentation has been extraordinary in that it has given us a lot of context, both political and economic, in regards to the political and economic situation under which the protests happen. And I am sure Rosa María will also have an opportunity to talk about these issues. Rosa María, do you want to use this?
I will use it.
Perfect.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you, Seth, for this idea. That was awesome. Javier, thank you so much. And I would like to start with the same note that you started, and it's talking about democracy and the relevance of democracy. According with the last Latino Barometer survey, in Latin America, which is the second youngest region in the world, right after Africa, the population between 16 years old and 40 years old said that only in the 51% of the cases they prefer democracy as a way of government. It means that almost the half of the youth in our region somehow does not prefer democracy as a way of government. This is very concerning, as you can imagine. And of course, it could and it has several motivations. It is probably driven by corruption, by the lack of delivery of the democratic governments in that part of the world. I would also say that this region have been submitted to the propaganda and the lies of one of the most old illiberal regimes in the world, which is the Cuban regime. And that is that for Latin America. But ironically, the citizens of that dictatorship, the Cuban dictatorship, have been opposing that oppression from the first day. And of course, this opposition has had several approaches during the years. It was violent at the beginning. It has been pacific or peaceful for the most part of these 63 years. And it ended up last year with the biggest protest that I have ever experienced, that I have ever seen, but probably the largest peaceful mobilization of the Cuban people in our history, not only against the communist dictatorship, but in the history of Cuba. And I have to say that this came as a surprise for many in the world, not for the Cuban people. And not for the Cuban people because from the very beginning, from the 1951, some Cubans start to resist the damage, to resist the oppression. And of course, from the beginning, the repression was brutal and had the goal of silence any kind of dissidence. And there are facts there to back it up. From the tens of thousands of political prisoners to the thousands of extrajudicial killings or arbitrary killings, my father being one of them, to the millions of political refugees, to the tens of thousands of mainly young Cubans that ended up in forced labor camps, not only for having a very organized or a specific line of opposition to the regime, but merely for dressing different, for being gay, for listening to music in English. Anyone with an alternative expression to the lines of the Cuban Communist Party was, and in many cases is, at risk of losing his or her job, his or her position at the university, his or her freedom, as it is the case in Cuba today, just for sharing a post in Facebook, or even their lives, as it happened to at least one of the protesters last July 11. And again, that spring that we lived last summer in Cuba, it was organic, it was probably not organized, but it was not an isolated incident. I come from a family that was part of that portion of the population that in Cuba was always excluded or somehow perceived by the regime as in opposition to the government. For reasons that at the beginning were not even political. When my father was 17 years old, this was 1968, he was one of these young folks that was sent to a forced labor camp. In his case, because he was Catholic and he was practicing, he was going to mass each Sunday. There he met others that were practicing Yoruba religions, which are Afro-Cuban religions, or that were gay, or just that were not understood by the regime as people that were in line with them. A few years after, in the late 80s, my father and a group of Cubans founded a movement that had the goal of inviting the Cuban people and impulsing among the Cuban people the reforms for them to demand their own rights, for the Cuban people to assume the role that we have, which is the protagonic role in the change in the system that we want to see. A role that does not belong, as Javier clearly said, does not belong to any foreign country, but to the Cuban people. So that he and many other Cubans led an initiative called the Varela Project. And I will talk very briefly about what the Varela Project was, because there is something that the Cuban regime has never dared to do. And that is actually submitting to the will of the people, or allowing the people to express that will. There have been more than 70 years without free, fair, and multi-party elections in my country. That is that the youngest person who participated in some sort of free and multi-party elections in Cuba, it is 88 years old today. That is that the young folks and the old folks that were protesting in the streets in Cuba never experienced democracy or fundamental human rights. However, they were screaming freedom, homeland, and life in the streets. So, my father and this group of people came out with a strategy to use that system that have never ever opened to the will of the people, that have never ever had the consent of the people, to use that system somehow against the system itself. The constitution in Cuba, that is a communist constitution, but it still had some articles that came from the previous constitution, for the democratic constitution, the last one in 1940. That constitution had an article that allowed for the initiative of law to the citizens, so that you don't need to be a member of the National Assembly to propose a law, but you have to gather at least 10,000 signatures. So these guys wrote a bill to say that the law have to change to guarantee freedom of expression, freedom of association, liberation for the political prisoners, so an amnesty law, some sort of free market, and a reform of the electoral law in order to have free, fair, and multi-party elections, and that everything should be asked to the people in a national referendum. That was the Varela Project. Of course, no one saw that in a moment in which, did you saw the graphic that Javier put here that said that in 2008 was the first time that Cubans had access to cell phones? Well, I'm talking about early 2000s. Before that, to have a cell phone in Cuba in that moment was a crime. No Cuban national could own a cell phone. And under those conditions, and under the repression that have always accompanied the Cuban dictatorship, these folks just start to gather signatures. And signature after signature, they gather tens of thousands of signatures. More than 60,000 signatures were collected in the midst of an oppressive totalitarian dictatorship. More than 30,000 of those signatures were delivered to the National Assembly in full compliance with the requirement of the Constitution. What was the reaction of the regime? First, they changed the constitution. Fidel Castro invented another massive gathering of signatures to change the constitution in order to do what? In order to make the socialist system that Javier just described and the political system, which is the ruling role of the Cuban Communist Party as the director of the society and the state, irrevocable. I think that the word that they use is irreversible. So you can do nothing to change those two provisions. The socialist character of the Cuban, they call it social economic system, and the absolute or the ruling role of the single Cuban Communist Party. Of course, none law could have a retroactive impact. The Varela project was already delivered. So actually that couldn't prevent the referendum that the Cubans were demanding. But when you are the leader of a totalitarian regime, you could violate rights with the praxis, and you can also violate your own law with your praxis. And that was what Fidel Castro did. But that didn't stop there. They accompanied the whole show with a repressive wave. And they put all the leaders of the Varela project, that of course was not something made by one man, but by a large and actually very diverse collective of Cuban citizens, some of them members of the opposition, some of them even members of the Communist Party. The Castro regime put all the leaders, the ones that were collecting the signatures, in jail. And that was known as the cause of the 75 in 2003. But my father, because they killed him a few years later. But tens of thousands of Cubans there in the early 2000s to put their name, their ID numbers, their address in a piece of paper that they knew was going to be delivered to the oppressors. And that will, that determination of the Cuban people to fight for their freedom continue alive in the Cuban population, even when the repression continued to increase, and even when the way of life of the Cuban people continued to deteriorate, to the point in which the Cuban nation was ranking as the most miserable country in the world, according with the Hunger Index in 2021, even when many Cubans don't have access to the most basic needs. And for basic needs, I'm not only referring to food, but also to medical attention, even to running water in a daily basis. Even under those conditions, the Cuban people keep demanding what I believe, and this is a personal opinion, keep demanding what I believe is a realization, a conviction that we have as a collective, and is that the reason why we live in misery, the reason why we cannot achieve our dreams in our country, the reason why almost the 25% of the Cuban population lives abroad, the reason why the Cuban people keep escaping the island, that reason is the lack of democracy and the lack of freedom. So that the Cuban people, when they went into the streets last year, after tens of thousands of deaths because of COVID, that were actually death because of the negligence of the Cuban regime, after having to live without the most basic needs or fighting for the most basic needs for the most part of their day, when they went into the streets, what they demand was freedom. And that demand has been the chanting of the whole year. Many people believe that the protests just stopped last summer because of the repression, and the repression has been brutal. And for brutal, I mean militarization of the whole country. There are more political prisoners in Cuba today than in the rest of the region, all combined. And in our region, we have Venezuela and Nicaragua, but there are more than 1,000 political prisoners in Cuba right now. And that's not taking into consideration the more or less 5,000 Cubans that are in jail because of laws as pre-criminal dangerousness, which is something like a minority report. If the regime thinks or believes that you're going to commit a crime, you could be in jail till 4 years. There are at least or around 5,000 Cubans in that condition in jail now. Even under those circumstances, the Cuban people is still in the streets. Last month was the second month with the highest number of protests since July 11. Sadly, that's not what we are seeing reflects in the press. Sadly, that's not what many people out of Cuba knows. But that has a very direct impact in not only the life of Cubans, but also the region, and especially the most closest countries to the island. For instance, that's one of the reasons why almost the 2% of the Cuban population has crossed the southern border of the US during the last 10 months. At least 200,000 Cubans has crossed the southern border of the US, looking for that freedom, of course, for a better life. But we understand how and why we cannot have a better life in Cuba. And by the way, that 200,000 Cubans is not even the largest population that has crossed the southern border during the last 10 months. Venezuelans are one of the largest populations. But Venezuelans are suffering the collapse of the democracy also because of the impact, in a way, of the Cuban regime. I encourage you guys to go to the last report of the fact-checking mission of the United Nations in Venezuela. They specifically said that, for instance, the counterintelligence of the military in Venezuela is run by Cubans. And Cubans meaning Cubans from the regime. The same counterintelligence and intelligence apparatus that is dedicated to repress Cubans and to kill dissidents and to put artists as the one that we saw singing in Patria, Vida just a few minutes ago. 2 of them are in jail right now since July 11 last year. One of them could be in a hunger strike right now. We don't even know because Luis Manuel Otero has been incommunicated for the most of the last month. So I suppose that I have exceeded my time already. But even when we talk about Latin America, we have to wonder what is lacking, what are we doing wrong to be a region that is so ambiguous in embracing democracy as at least the less of the evils. And when we are so concerned about the options that citizens in general and youth in particular could be taken today in Latin America, well, those most affected by the lack of freedom and democracy, which are the citizens of Cuba, and especially the youth of Cuba, they are risking their life in order to achieve freedom and democracy.
Thank you, Rosa Maria, for this incredibly powerful testimony. I think I want to open up the floor for questions. I wanted to have a rejoinder between the panelists in the response to the respective presentations, but we're at the 5:30 mark, and I do have a few questions of my own, but I really do not want to give priority to that because we have here a group of students that I'm sure are learning a lot from you. And so I want to start with them, and then depending on how we go with their questions in the dialogue that opens up between them and you, we'll see if I can get my questions in, okay? All right, so I have a question right here. Says, could you help us out?
Hello, is this on?
Yeah, that's
Thank you. So I just had a question. I think among dictatorships, I think Cuba is, I would say, among some circles abroad, viewed quite positively. I think from the Cuban doctor's story to developing a vaccine during COVID, there are some, I think, perceptions that that the regime is doing good things. And I think particularly one narrative that I saw online during the protests was whenever someone posted negative things about the protests on Twitter, there would be a response, your grandfather was the police chief in Havana during Batista's time. That's, gotcha. And I'm just curious about how, if you have any insights on this kind of, I mean, on some level for PR campaign, or where positive stories like these are generated from. Is this kind of just people wanting the regime to be good? Where do these perceptions come from?
Do you want to collect a few questions, or do you want to go ahead and?
Let's collect a few, yeah.
All right. So let's see. Who else wants to ask a question? Maybe we can have 2 or 3 before our panelists respond. Don't be shy. I have a question right back there, Nayeli. Yeah, that works.
So I guess my question was from an activist perspective. What has been sort of the role that you've seen from the Cuban diaspora, those who have sort of been displaced and fleed Cuba to the United States or other parts of the world? Have there been sort of like strong organizations or projects or grassroots movements connecting back to projects within Cuba itself? What has been the outcomes of those sort of collaborations or interactions between the Cuban diaspora and also Cubans who are currently living in the country?
Thank you for that question. Let's see if we can get another one in before we get an answer. I have Ana Luisa right here. No, let's wait for the microphone because there's a webinar going on.
Hi. Okay. Hi. This is for Rosa Maria. Hi. And I was wondering, like, as a Cuban yourself, well, both of you, obviously. I was wondering, what do you think the next steps would be, if possible, like towards democratization? Having lived it, obviously, like studied what would you say? That countries that might be at risk of falling into like a similar path as Cuba, for example, as Venezuela. What do you think should be like the next thing to do? That's my question.
Why don't we start with those 3, and then we'll see if we can collect a few more. You want to use this?
Sure. The Cuban Revolution absolutely has its fans. The fan base is very reduced now, and it's very, very hard to find positive things. There's no regime that is 100% evil. And that, I'm never going to get engaged in a conversation of taking a regime like South Africa's apartheid and identify its 4 or 5 achievements. I would never do that. It seems unethical to try to find some triumphs in a sea of major human rights setbacks. A lot of the information that people use to praise the deliveries, the deliverables of the Cuban regime is based on information that is very seldom audited by real organs, by non-independent actors. Cuba's economic figures, for example, require specific knowledge of the tricks and all the things that they do, and not everybody can do it. So there's that, but there's no question that the Cuban Revolution gave rise to a romanticism about an anti-imperialist, perhaps the first Latin American nation in a post-colonial world to say no to the United States. And everybody has wanted this regime to go well, and everybody's rooting for it, but it has gotten very tiring to see people still trying to defend what I think is the indefensible. I'm going to let you talk about the diaspora because you're in Miami, and but on the next steps, let me just say something very briefly. I do think that Rosa Maria was saying something very interesting. The beginning of this form of autocracy in Cuba started in a way that is replicable in many other countries. In Cuba, there was a moment in which citizens were very sick of the status quo, and they were looking for a messiah, and a messiah who would come in and throw out everything that was old, including all institutions, and declare himself a person above the law. And to believe that the cause, the goals, the new objectives, in this case, a freer, more equal society, justified getting rid of the system of rules on rulers and the system of tolerance for pluralism. So my only thing for those who are interested in this is, if you don't want to end up like this, just be very careful with, when you're very dissatisfied with the status quo, don't fall for messiahs. Because the most important lesson that we know from liberal democracy is that unless the state cannot control itself, it will end up controlling citizens. As to what do we do with an authoritarian regime like Cuba in the way that it is, I feel that this is a type of situation that is absolutely hopeless for external actors to act upon. Everything that can be done to help Cuban citizens survive, maintain energy, optimism, insist, get organized, is a step in the right direction. Ultimately, there has to be domestic pressure. This is the central insight of any study of social movements. The pressure has to come from social movements from within. It has to be strategic, it has to be relentless, and it has to be heroic. And I don't know what else we can say. I wish I could be better in answering this great question.
Thank you. The Cuban diaspora is as part of the Cuban people as the Cubans in the island. And that's kind of, I don't know, logic, right? It's basic. But for decades, that simple fact has been challenged and has been questioned by the narrative and the propaganda and the codes of the Cuban regime. When you add that with the isolation that the Cubans in the island have been suffering because of that same regime, well, logically, you're going to end up with big differences, or what it seems like big differences. I do believe that that bridge has been crossed lately because it's very censored and it's very limited, but there is access to internet in the island. There are more people that have been able to get out and to return. Now that window is also closing more and more because repression is increasing. But I do believe that we are in a state of much more understanding from both sides. That doesn't mean that there are not challenges there. But if something I took away from the July 11 moment that I believe right now it was just a qualitative step in the right direction in a process of what I believe is liberation. But if something I understood in that moment was that the Cubans on and off the island share a unity of purpose. And we saw it when hundreds of thousands of Cubans took to the streets in Santiago de Cuba, in Havana, and across tens of cities and towns on the island. The same thing happened in the world. The same thing happened in Miami, but also in New York, but also in Washington, but also in Madrid, but also in Asunción, Uruguay. Each place where there was a Cuban, there was a protest of people saying, well, if Cubans are in the streets in Cuba, we are in the streets in Miami or in Madrid or in wherever we are. That was, of course, a beautiful moment, but was also a moment of realization. Hey, we could think different, have different approaches, but we more or less think alike in that point that is essential, and is that we need that freedom, we need that democracy. And that also leads us to the following question, which is the next steps. And just as Javier said, the Cuban people is and have to be the protagonists of this fight. And I think that we are being those protagonists. I cannot rule out the fact that in the last probably 20 years, we have seen peaceful revolutions start, kind of succeed, and fail in the world. From Iran to Venezuela, we have seen very important, organic, even better organized movements, peaceful movements, demand rights, freedoms, demanding democracy, failing. Or at least not achieving a stable democracy. So even when Cubans are risking their lives for that freedom, are actually taking the greatest possible risk, which is your freedom and your life in the streets, we do need the support of the international community. And that support needs to be translated into actions. Javier put a very, very good example that was South Africa and what the world did to support the end of the apartheid in South Africa. It was a world reaction in support of the movement that was already taking place in South Africa in favor of civil rights. Well, Cubans, Venezuelans, we're not less. We also need that kind of support. We also need that kind of pressure over those that are taking the decision, for instance, to put Luis Manuel Otero in jail because he sang a song. And if you ask me, I believe that that's what lacking right now.
Thank you very much to both for these responses. I again want to prioritize questions or comments that are coming from the audience. So if there's other students or people or faculty who want to ask a question, please, we want to hear from you.
Yeah, so Rosa Maria, when you started out your panel, you said that almost like half the region, 49%, 51%, they didn't want to embrace democracy. Do you know why that's the case?
Yes, I mean, I refer you, I was actually quoting the Latino Barometer, which is an organization that makes surveys in Latin America. And they published a survey among this portion of the population in Latin America, and to the question of what system of government you prefer, only the 51% of the population in that range of age marked democracy. So that was what I was referring to. And I hope I didn't sound that lapidary, but that's just what the survey showed.
Do we have other questions in the audience? We are about to wrap up, but if you don't mind, I would like to ask a couple of very brief questions before we let our audience move on and do other things. The panel is scheduled until 6, so we should be wrapping up really soon. But I have one question of return durability in one of the points that Javier made during his presentation in regard to the embargo. You mentioned that you have changed your view about the embargo, and I imagine those two are related, issues of authoritarian durability and opposing the embargo. And so if you could elaborate on that, I think it would be great. And then for Rosa Maria, I wanted to ask you, why is it the case? So last year, there was the Cuban protests were in the news cycle, and we were very much aware of them. And what you're telling us today is that these protests are ongoing, but somehow they have faded from the news cycle. Is this? And I want to ask you why. Why is this the case? Is this a matter of just the media getting distracted by other things, and this not no longer being important for producing clicks and garnering attention, or is it something more ominous in the way in which information comes out from the island in contrast to what happened last year? Whatever insight you have in that regard, in whatever order you want to answer these questions, it's perfect.
So on the question on the embargo and on sanctions in general, obviously it is the one instrument that the West has whenever it has to deal with human rights abuses. And my thinking on this is that sanctions do work to encourage regimes to change certain practices. They are less successful in toppling regimes. It's a fine but important distinction. Some sanctions can topple some regimes, maybe, but it's a little bit like bowling. You get 2 shots. If it doesn't happen right away, what occurs is that the regime learns to survive under economic hardship, transfers the economic hardships to people, and the sanctions begin to hurt the people more than the state. So in the medium term, after the initial blow, if they survive it, then the advantage goes to the state. And so they become actually mechanisms that enable authoritarian survival. And that's one of the arguments why, with time, authoritarian regimes are able to survive very tough economic duress, especially if they're imposed from abroad. It's plenty of other reasons, but this is now my thinking on it. And we're in a predicament because they do work to get, for example, release some prisoners, change certain policies, come to a negotiating table, things like that, all of which are super important. But the toppling of a regime and producing regime change, there's very little evidence of success. There are some success stories, so they're minor, but they're, to me, not enough to be overwhelming evidence on their ability to bring down autocratic regimes.
Yes, because that ability is the ability of the people, and should always be the responsibility of the people. I only add to that the democratic government has the responsibility of supporting that demand when it comes from the citizens. And that's what I believe needs to be reinforced in the case of Cuba. And there is many other ways in which a democratic government can support that. For instance, the Cuban regime has been sitting comfortably in the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations for decades without consequences. The Cuban regime has been praised by the international community with issues like, for instance, the medical missions that are actually trafficking in person strategies that actually have been criticized by United Nations and equal to forced labor operations. But what we hear in the press, what we see in the press about it, is the propaganda of the Cuban regime and not the facts that even an organization of the United Nations have put together for the people to know. So there is a lot of work to do if you are a democratic government to stop that kind of behavior in the international forum. I also believe that individual sanctions, as the one that, for instance, legislations as the one that you have here in the States or in Canada or in the European Union, with versions of the Magnitsky Act that allows these governments and institutions to target the criminals personally and to tackle their personal interests. Those, in a moment, as the one that we are living right now in Cuba, in which we have a group of power directing direct repression against the people, we have criminals against humanity ruling a country. Those, I believe, could be effective, at least to stop one of the most dangerous characteristics of these regimes, and is impunity, and is being able to act as criminals and not having any consequence for that. So why we are seeing in the press, or why we are not seeing what's going on in Cuba in the press is, I believe that there are multiple factors. The fact that there is a war in Ukraine is one of them. The fact that the lies and the propaganda that the Cuban regime have been able to put in place for decades is not only affecting citizens in the world, but also those that write the news and those that present those news. The fact that Cuba and the Cuban citizens are very isolated for that kind of press. The journalists in Cuba are independent journalists. Many of them are in jail just for the fact that they are reporting. And those that belong to foreign press agencies to stay in Cuba, they have to report more or less in line with what the Cuban regime allows them to report. So it is a challenge actually to have access to the real information, to what is going on the island. So the invitation is to make an effort and to look for what is going on and to look for the independent media. There's another challenge, and it's that the independent media writes in Spanish. And so there's not that much information in English, but facts are there. Life is taking place in the island, and as we saw just briefly when I mentioned migration, but I can mention many other factors that actually has an impact in the States and in the rest of the region, well, when we are asking for solidarity, when we are asking for actions or for support to elevate the voices of the Cuban people, we are also making an ask for the stability of the democracy and peace, not only in Cuba, but in the rest of the continent.
Well, it's almost 6 p.m., so we're gonna stop right here. Please join me in giving our panelists an applause. I really want to thank you, welcome you to Colgate again. Thank you for being here, and thank you to all the audience for showing up and showing interest in this topic. For those of you who signed up for dinner, please stay right here. We're gonna go there